that this government has campaigned and continues to work towards with legislation such as this, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Speaker, embedded in the last sentence of the member who has just resumed his seat were the words rational and conservative sitting alongside each other. Now, the central tenet of the Labour Party's view is that they don't belong in the same sentence because there's nothing rational about economic conservatism when you are already in a recession. But I will come on to that in the second half of my remarks today. Let us first consider what the purpose of this bill is, and I'll repeat at the outset that Labour will be supporting the bill to Select Committee, but we will assess then our final position. The reason for that is that on the one hand, we support the need to increase contributions to the International Monetary Fund, A, because it's our responsibility as a member country, and B, because international events have proven, as if there was ever any doubt, that we are one interdependent global economy and that confidence in that economy requires countries to be able to join together to stand behind its core institutions. However, we oppose the power grab by the executive opposite to say that any future changes can be made by a regulation-making power and don't require reference to Parliament. Well, when the total cost of this subvention is $3 billion, you better believe that taxpayers think their representatives ought to be able to debate it. So our position is, yes, we do want to be responsible members of the global community. No, we don't want to write a blank cheque to the current executive or any executive, even ourselves in 2 years, because we think that this is a matter of significant substance and it deserves Parliament's time. Mr Speaker, let's just quickly recall what this bill is about in substance. It will amend the International Financial Agreement Act of 1961. That is the act that allows the Government of New Zealand to meet its obligations to the International Monetary Fund. This particular bill increases our contribution to that from 1518 million special drawing rights, or SDRs, to 1592 million. That's approximately $2.9 to $3 billion. That's a lot of money. Now, the first question that must be asked is, why is New Zealand contributing, besides the fact that we're obligated to? And the answer to that is very, very clear. As if it was ever in doubt that the global economy was interdependent, one needs only look at the events of 2008, 2009 and subsequently, with the collapse of many global finance and derivative markets, many merchant investment banks, and the near freezing of global credit. We missed by a whisker a rerun of the Great Depression, and it was only because of the concerted intervention of central banks and of global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, like the European Central Bank, that we avoided catastrophe. Now, near catastrophe hasn't been that great because we face a decade of deleveraging, the so-called new normal. Well, I guess the good news is it put the lie to the Washington consensus that we're all neoliberals now, because we aren't. And this side of the House clearly is not, as I look around. That was never the fact, but the myth has been busted. The myth has been busted. However, international cooperation is now more needed than ever. One needs only look at the current crisis in Europe, which has caused enormous volatility in international equity markets, up about 0.5% today, down 2% just on Friday, and enormous change from day to day, week to week. Now, the issue that we've seen in the last week in Europe has been really important. Greece has had an election. They have not been able to form a new centre-right government because the Greek Parliament overwhelmingly is opposed to the European austerity plan. In France, the neoliberal conservative president has been thrown out, and the first socialist president elected in 2 decades, and with that a clear message that France no longer accepts the tenets of austerity economics. And today, on Stuff's website, there is an excellent article by Nobel laureate economist Joseph Stiglitz, who says, seldom is it explained how to square the circle How can confidence be restored as the crisis economies plunge into recession? How can growth be revived when austerity will almost surely mean a further decrease in aggregate demand, sending output and employment even lower? This should we know by now. Markets on their own are not stable. Not only do they repeatedly generate destabilising asset bubbles, but when demand weakens, forces that exacerbate the downturn come into play. How right he is. No wonder he got that Nobel Prize. But of course, this is not a foreign issue. We know we have to contribute to provide strength to the European Central Bank and the IMF in this case. We know that collective action to head off the consequences of that burst financial bubble are essential, and that's why we're putting in $3 billion of New Zealand taxpayers' money. It's our underwrite. But the lessons also, Mr. Speaker, come closer to home, and here I want to refer again to the Honourable Dr. Nick Smith thinking that conservatism was rational. What is rational about chasing your fiscal tail down a long dark tunnel where every move you make reduces tax revenue and you have to come back to the country to reduce expenditure, making unemployment worse, taxes worse, and growth worse? You know, it takes a long time to work one's way out of that long dark tunnel, and New Zealand's been down there before. It was called the Forbes Coates Coalition in the 1930s, and it ended in the election of Michael Joseph Savage. Just like in the US, the Humphrey experiment ended with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And he didn't muck around. That was a crisis. He came and we said, got to put people back to work. Let's plant some trees. And they had the Civilian Conservation Corps. They froze banking transactions because they were in the middle of a crisis. They underwrote the banks and they got moving from there. Now, we're not in quite that world now. But the point remains that if reliance had been placed on free markets acting on their own in 1932, 33, 34, the US would not have stabilised and been ready to fight World War II. And also in New Zealand, we would have had a longer, darker recession had Michael Joseph Savage and the first Labour government not restored hope, not restored growth, not restored direction, and in modern terms, restored strategy for the New Zealand economy. And that is what is lacking today, Mr. Speaker, a clear plan. Even the business community is expressing its disappointment about the current government's lack of direction and a plan, its tendency to become mired in one-off deals for favoured mates, and is now getting its head around the fact that there's likely to be a change of government in 2.5 years' time. And so business is now once again talking to the Labour opposition in the most serious terms about what our alternative program will look to. In other words, Mr. Bennett, the smart money has already moved. The member for Remuera sitting behind you knows what that means. He knows what the smart money moving means. He means that's a vote of no confidence in this government, and that vote of no confidence is well and richly deserved. But, Mr. Speaker, this is an international bill, and it is about our contribution to a very important international institution, the International Monetary Fund, not known as a hotbed of socialism. But the International Monetary Fund over the last 5 years has reminded all member governments that austerity economics will make the crisis worse, and has advised them to invest for growth and jobs. And that is what we need to do in New Zealand, Mr. Speaker, to invest for growth and jobs, a systematic partnership between government and business that will lift employment, lift output, lift tax revenues, and therefore lift our budget balance. We cannot continue to chase our economic tail down a long, dark tunnel of austerity economics. It will not work. It does not work, and as the voters of France have just shown, it will not last. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.